Hi, and welcome to the third part of our four-part series on European imperialism. These are notes 11.2c, and this is, of course, Mr. Marx. The focus of this presentation is going to be the British presence in India and its imperialism in there. In order to understand the British presence in India, you have to understand the British East India Company. Those of you who have watched the Pirates of the Caribbean movies have seen just kind of the nasty reputation that the East Indian Company has gained. If you remember the Boston Tea Party, the tea which was thrown into Boston Harbor was tea that had come through the British East India Company. The British East India Company was actually part of two companies that have a very long history. They were formed, or were granted their ability to form into a company all the way back to Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. After some outside challenges, the two companies merged together and formed the British East India Company. They were main goal was to supply tea and other spices and other sorts of hard-to-find things from India and transport it into England to give England a real monopoly on those areas. And it's from the British East India Company's marketing that most Great Britain, or people in Great Britain would come to have tea as a major part of their life, tea time and other sorts of things. Due to some rebellions that started occurring as Indians started to revolt against this idea of the Europeans taking things out of India without full compensation, the British East India Company was actually granted complete rule of India in 1757. If you can picture that, the country was ruled by this really powerful company that almost worked as a country in itself. It almost had its own empire. This rule of India by a company would last until a rebellion occurred in 1858. Following that Indian rebellion, Queen Victoria is going to dissolve the British East India Company, and she's going to take control of it itself, putting India under the control of the British Crown. That makes it so they're put into direct control of the area while still working with the local Rajas. If you remember, those are Indian leaders. In order to make sure her wishes were met, she appointed a viceroy. The one on the left is the first viceroy, the first governor general of British India, and he's going to take over after the British East India Company had left in 1773. And on the right, you actually see the last viceroy. As you see, over time, the Indians themselves will get to hold that position. And he was viceroy all the way into 1948. It won't be until after World War II that India will find itself freed from this British imperialism. The British had both positive and negative effects on India. As far as the British were concerned, they were bringing order and stability. Before the British had gotten there, before the East India had gotten there, there were a lot of wars and conflicts between the different Rajas, between the Hindus and the Muslims. The British brought a stability to that by bringing in their troops and saying, if you didn't obey us, then we'll tear you down. They brought in a new educational system. It still was really unfair. The Indians would be forced to be in certain schools while the British children themselves were put into other segregated schools, but it was still an educational system that had not been there before. And they brought technology. They connected India with railroads and telegraph systems and other sorts of things which really moved India up into the more modern world at the time. Not everything was great, though. The British East India Company and then later Britain itself was known for a great deal of corruption in its government. Officials would accept bribes as part of their salary. That led to a very corrupt tax collection system. Meanwhile, because the British were forcing their products onto India and India could only buy from Britain during the time, local industries which had flourished before almost completely died out. And on top of this, of all the things, they reduced food production because, again, Britain was able to supply India from its other colonies. This wasn't going to be so much of an issue for India while it's under Britain's rule, but will cause severe issues as India experiences a population boom and simply doesn't have the farmland or the farming technology to be able to cover for it. So, what was the role of the British East India Company in the world, especially in India? All right, our first review question for this. And then, how did the British both help and harm the people of India?